We are walking through a minefield now. Well, we know where a lot of the mines are, the various feedbacks that we will trigger when we cross tipping points between 1.5 degrees and 3 degrees, by which time we should have tripped every one of them.
Welcome to the Challenging Climate Podcast, where we discuss the big ideas and controversies in climate change with leading experts. The climate is changing. Join us as we try to keep up. I'm Jesse Reynolds, an environmental policy specialist. My co-host Pete Irvin is unable to join us today. In this episode, my guest is writer Gwynne Dyer, who has worked as a freelance journalist, columnist, broadcaster, and lecturer on international affairs for more than 20 years. He is originally trained as a historian, and his new book, Intervention Earth: Life-Saving Ideas from the World's Climate Engineers, is now available and is the topic of our conversation today. Gwynne, welcome to Challenging Climate.
Thank you, Jesse.
As I mentioned, you have a new book, Intervention Earth, that's based on many extensive interviews with experts working across the issue of climate change. What are the central messages of your new book?
Well, I did a book about, a dozen years ago now, which was essentially about the geopolitics of climate change. So I did talk to a great many climate scientists, but it was not about the science, really. It was more about the politics surrounding the science, particularly the long-term implications of not getting this right for the politics of the planet. And then I went away for a while because I'd sort of shot my wad, But time passes and nothing much is happening, and the science is getting better, but the crisis is becoming more acute, and there is no motion. And you get to the point where you can count on your fingers how many years we've got left before we have passed the last exit on the freeway, so to speak. And this nagged at me. I didn't want to do this, actually. I had lots of interesting things to do. They're more up my alley, like, wars in the Middle East, wars in Europe nowadays, all the stuff I've done all my life. But it drew me back in because it is the biggest topic by far. The most important for outcomes of the human race is not the war in Ukraine or the war in Gaza. It is the climate. And so I thought, well, okay, I'll go and do another book. I'll interview a couple of dozen climate scientists and figure out what their take is on where we sit now and what are the obstacles that are holding us back and how do you get around them. Well, that was 4 years ago. And I ended up interviewing I should say my wife and I, because we're going to make a television series out of this eventually, or at least we hope to. So Tina and I ended up interviewing about 100 on film. 100 climate scientists, engineers, some other people as well in the political realm and so on, but primarily climate scientists. And as I say, 4 years, the book came out, and it's still coming out in various places, and in series, so I can get there. So Australia next, I think. And I still am obsessed. I'm afraid I can't get away from it because it is the biggest topic and the most infuriating because the solutions are there, but they're not being applied. And that's very frustrating. I recognize that I belong to a species that's only recently emerged from hunter-gatherer-dom, and that you mustn't expect us to be fully mature and take long-term views on things. Hunter-gatherers did not prosper by taking long-term views. That's not the modus operandi. So, you try to practice patience and advise others to do the same, but you can't negotiate with the climate. The process is advancing as we dump 40 megatons of carbon dioxide and other gases into the atmosphere each year. And even right now, we are experiencing worse incoming changes than we anticipated at this stage in the proceedings. It is, I think, moving faster than most people thought it would 5 years ago. And it was always guesstimates, of course, because we were exploring unknown territory with some hypotheses about how things work up front, but no clear answers until you get there. So I wrote this book. The conclusion that I started with, although I then trekked through all the arguments that got me to that conclusion, was that we have, in some senses, run out of time for the original approach, which was to cut our emissions And if we started doing that even at 2% a year back in the early 1990s, we'd be okay. We wouldn't be out of the woods entirely, but we would have a clear path out and we wouldn't be anywhere near a cliff edge. But we didn't do that. And looking back, I recognize that it was always unlikely we would do that. So we are now, I don't know this to be the case, but I fear and suspect that it is the case that we have found the first of the big feedbacks that we did not anticipate. We are walking through a minefield now. Well, we know where a lot of the mines are, the various feedbacks that we will trigger when we cross tipping points between 1.5 degrees, which is where we are right now, above pre-industrial global temperature, average global temperature, and 3 degrees, by which time we should have tripped every one of them. But we may have tripped the first already. So the question then becomes, okay, your emissions mitigation is necessary, must continue, must accelerate, but it is a bit too late just to do that because you're already seeing physical manifestations of climate change that will have political and economic repercussions. They, including generating hordes of refugees and causing breakdowns in governmental control in large parts of the world, conflicts of various sorts, and distractions which will further draw us away from doing the most urgent thing. So what, and foremost among the new things we do have to consider, is holding the heat down while we work at getting the emissions under control and eventually reducing the emissions we've already put into the stratosphere, unless you plan to live the rest of history with the climate considerably hotter than it is now, because we're committed to a climate considerably hotter than it is now already, probably 2 degrees plus. Unless you find a way of extracting carbon dioxide from the atmosphere a good deal more rapidly than the rocks will do it. So it becomes, therefore, a plea and an investigation of means of holding the temperature down. Temporarily, of course. You mustn't do this too long or you pile up another set of problems for yourself. But it is very striking that all of the modeling, and it's all we've got is modeling, all of the modeling suggests that all of your problems diminish if you can move back towards pre-industrial temperatures. And all of your problems rapidly multiply if you continue to move away from pre-industrial temperatures. Therefore, if you have any means of moving back towards them, or at least stopping where you are now in terms of average global temperature, or even stopping half of what we're experiencing now, which is what is probably technologically available to us, you should do it. And you should start yesterday.
Your summary covered a lot of your book quite well. In the questions ahead, I'll try to touch on a lot of these points. Let's work through these one at a time. One item you mentioned is feedbacks. Your book spends quite some time diving into the idea of climate feedbacks, of particularly the dangerous type. How might these occur? Could you provide an example? And what might the consequences be of such a feedback?
Well, one we're certainly seeing at the moment is the 4 times higher speed of warming in the Arctic than there is warming on the planet as a whole. This was predicted, and it is driven by the fact that as the ice and the snow melt, it exposes open water and dark rock, both of which will absorb a large amount of sunlight that previously was reflected back into space. And sunlight reflected back into space does not cause warming. So you just lost a major cooling element in the global balance. That's a feedback. Other feedbacks that will cause major problems, believe it. First of all, because it will cause certain cascade phenomena as you get sea level rise out of that, not from the melting ice on the sea, but from the melting ice on land, the glaciers of the Greenland and Antarctica. So you're looking at perhaps a meter extra sea level rise by the end of the century or more, beyond what we currently have booked in for. If the melting of the sea ice continues, and I can't actually see how it's going to stop unless you start doing really rapid cooling in the Arctic using sort of geoengineering techniques about yesterday. So there's one, but actually there's up to 15 of them that we have cataloged. Like most lists can come up with 12 or 15, but it's a lot. I mean, it's losing the Amazon rainforest and turning most of inland Brazil into a savanna, which is not nearly as good at absorbing carbon dioxide. And actually the Congo rainforest, same thing. Or the loss of the Antarctic ice, which is a whole different issue. And 90% of the ice is in the Antarctic, not in Greenland. And then you're looking at really runaway sea level rise. With beyond the cascade character of the actual physical changes, has cascades of political changes as well. So there's one fellow I know that you're in the Netherlands, and it's very relevant to you. There's a fellow in the Netherlands and another one in Hamburg in Germany who have come up with the idea for what they call the Great North Sea Barrier, which is an idea that if sea level rise continues at the current rate, basically North Germany, the Netherlands, and a great deal of other territory around the North Sea and the Baltic Sea go underwater, including not exactly where I live in London, but not far down the road. So, you can struggle with this by building 100 equivalents of the Thames barrier to hold the sea back from the Thames Valley for another 20, 50, or 50 years. Or you could just dam up the whole of the North Sea and the Baltic Sea by running dams between Cornwall and Brittany, and another couple of barriers between Scotland and the Orkney Islands and the Shetland Islands, and then across to Norway. So that with one single huge dam, you have saved yourself the effort of building 100 small dams and losing a lot of territory where you couldn't afford to build dams. But, there's some very large downsides to that as well, like eventually, first of all, you've got to pump all the water that comes into the North Sea and the rivers out over the dam, or else you'll go underwater anyway. And secondly, you're turning a saltwater sea into a freshwater sea over time by doing that. So, you don't want to go there, but all that sort of stuff keeps coming up as you explore the implications of sea level rise, temperature rise, all that stuff. So feedbacks. It's still the case. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, has got better at dealing with feedbacks now than it used to be because basically it ignored them. In the earlier meetings of the IPCC, they had these climate models which gave you smooth, gradually rising curves of temperature driven solely by our carbon dioxide emissions and other greenhouse gas emissions, and took no account of feedback effects where our warming triggers some natural phenomenon that also causes warming or causes sea level rise or something else that you really didn't want. Now we have much more of that incorporated in the IPCC reports and in the general climate discussion. But like most minefields, you don't know where some of the mines are. And I think we are in that situation. Our calculations about how rapidly warming will proceed. That, yes, it will go on going up. I think the current rate of warming, although this is open to dispute given recent events, current rate of warming is something like 1/4 of a degree Celsius per decade. 0.28 or something like that, up from, it used to be 0.18, but they went back over the data, and now it's 0.28 of a degree Celsius per decade of warming. Well, that's nice. I mean, it's a problem, but it gives you some time. But the feedbacks could completely sabotage that expectation if they were big enough. And you don't know when they're going to hit, and you don't know how big they will be, and you don't know what some of them may be. For example, we may be in one right now that we didn't know about, because the sea surface temperatures in the past year have been very anomalous.
Yeah.
Much higher than predicted, much higher than they have ever been. And as time passes and the El Nino dissipates, and it's pretty well gone, and the warming of the sea surface does not drop back to where it was before, you may detect signs of something else going on in the ocean. It was a much bigger change than previous El Ninos would account for. The El Nino is now gone, and I just looked it up before we came on here. Sea surface average global temperature is at 1.5 this month. it got up above 1.6 at the peak of the El Nino, and the El Nino's gone away, which would certainly bring it back down. But it should be going back down to about 1.2 if we haven't had a big problem, because, that's where it was when El Nino started. And we don't appear to be heading back down there. So therefore, it is entirely possible that we are no longer seeing warming at the rate of 0.28 of a degree per decade, but some other number, which may be higher or very much higher, may persist or may be a one-off jump. We don't know. The point is all these damn landmines, some of which we know about but aren't doing anything. I was caught in a minefield once in the Bekaa Valley a long time ago, walking out of it when you can see some of the landmines because the wind had blown the sand off the surface, a bunch of anti-tank mines. And we'd been filming there. And then we noticed the mines and we had to walk out after we finished doing the stand up. And the point is you could see some and you could avoid those, but you knew that the wind hadn't blown the sand off all of them. We're in that situation, I think.
An interesting part of your book and hopefully your forthcoming series is your extensive interviews with climate scientists.
Yes.
I'd like to hop over to that. I find that the climate change community, including but not limited to the scientists, tend to have a sort of a unified public message. If we don't do anything, things will be bad. If we take action, there's still time to correct course and things will be okay. Not great, but okay. There's always time to correct course. That's been the consistent message of the climate change community, including these scientists now for 25 or 30 years. What was your sense by speaking to these 100+ scientists and others about their real sense of future possibilities and future likelihoods? Are their public statements consistent with their beliefs? Are they being frank, right? Or are they self-censoring in a consistent way?
They are getting increasingly frank, but I do have form on this. I mean, I've been interviewing climate scientists for 10 or 15 years, and they were all in public denial, or almost all in public denial 10 years ago still. In the sense that if you sat down, you immediately detected that they were holding back their worst fears, because you're a journalist and you will tell the public what they tell you, and they don't want to discourage the public or undermine the cause or whatever. Things have obviously got worse. And ability to believe that mitigation, cutting emissions alone will be enough has eroded. So it is certainly the case that climate scientists now are, I would say, showing their grief more. And I choose the word grief quite deliberately. Some anger wouldn't be amiss in this issue, but you can't live with anger over the long run, whereas you can sort of live with grief over the long run. And they are to an extent conflicted between the need not to, in fact, declare despair, because that disarms everybody and makes them useless, and telling them the full truth, on the other hand, is necessary to motivate them. This is a very difficult line to walk, and you can see them wavering over to one side of the line, and then even in the course of a half-hour interview or an hour interview, they'll be on both sides of that line. I don't blame them. I'm not mocking them at all. We're all doing the same thing, really, in a sense. I mean, as a journalist, I know that it's very easy and tempting to just say, you're screwed. But you mustn't, and partly because, in general, there are some alternatives left if you look hard enough, and also it demotivates, so don't do it. There was a very interesting study done where they interviewed by email, I think, all the people who had contributed to the last climate assessment, the one that preceded the Glasgow summit. They couldn't get them all, but they managed to contact about 100 of the 200 people who had written parts of that assessment and asked them their expectations about climate change. And I can't remember exactly how they phrased the question, but the key question was, do you think we will be able to hold the warming below 2 degrees? And then another question, if not, where do you think we'll end up? And there were 3 people out of the 100 who said below 2 degrees. A scatter, probably the majority said 3 degrees, but many went beyond that. And these are their private expectations, not based on research, but on a long body of research, a wide spread of knowledge, a great deal of contemplation, much of it awake at night. But the expectations that they could reveal anonymously, because these were anonymized questions, but would be reluctant to say in public. I also have numerous instances where I now have enough track on some of the people I have interviewed over the past 15 years a couple of times that I can actually recall when they denied that there was a problem and now admit that the key question is, do you think we're going to have to geoengineer at some point? Is it going to get that bad? And my answer would be, what do you mean it's already that bad? But quite well-known figures who would once have said, nonsense, we can fix this, that's too dangerous, we don't know the outcomes, who will now say, yes, we're going to have to do that, and will you go public with it? Well, you are by definition going public with it when you talk to me. So in a way, they're prepared to do that.
Before we get into geoengineering more strictly defined as a way to temporarily keep the Earth a bit cooler during this likely future peak warming, I will observe that during my 20-some years of watching the climate change debate, what I've seen in the more recently, let's say the last 10 or 8 years, is a change in how the scientists are saying we can keep 1.5 alive. We can keep warming within 1.5. One change in which they frame this is keeping warming within 1.5 at the end of the century. Maybe we'll overshoot it temporarily in the meantime, but come 2100, we'll bring it back down. And related to that is that it's now widely acknowledged that a key component of keeping 1.5 alive, of keeping warming within 1.5, whether there's overshoot or not, is removing carbon dioxide and maybe some other greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere at a large scale. And coincidentally, just as we record this, not too far from where you're sitting there in London, is a major conference on carbon dioxide removal. It's called the Negative Emissions Conference, but the idea is the same. What's your sense on how carbon dioxide removal is fitting into scientists' vision of limiting dangerous climate change to reasonable levels? And do you think it's a realistic vision? Where are the opportunities here?
I think it's the cart before the horse. Now, I mean, you need both the horse and the cart to get somewhere, but this is an odd way to do it, in the sense that carbon dioxide removal is necessary in the long run if you don't want the rest of human history to be lived at 2 or 3 degrees higher average global temperature, which will have very catastrophic effects. Catastrophic. There is no such thing as very catastrophic, but you know what I mean. If we only manage to stop the warming at 2.5, and by then North India is uninhabitable and food production has dropped by 40%, do you really want to spend the rest of history that way? And if not, then you're going to have to bring the carbon dioxide level in the atmosphere back down to what it was in, let's say, 1990. 350 would be great parts per million. We're at 425 now, so that requires removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So I'm happy to see this technology being developed. But I don't regard it as very urgent. As long as we're dumping 40 billion tons, a year of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, taking a few million tons out as a demonstration of a technology is appropriate, as a strategy for preserving human life and the current global system, it's a bit premature. What you should be doing is working on getting your emissions down and, I think, on holding the temperature down so you never get to 2.5 or 3 degrees higher average global temperature with the catastrophic losses of food production, life, everything. So spend a little bit of money on it. The oil industry wants to do this, and we do need a way to get all those people different jobs in the same parts of the world, and this might hold out some hope for them. And, Occidental will even invest in it. But, that's not where you should be making the big push. The big push needs to be mitigation and geoengineering, climate engineering. The climate engineering is a stopgap. It's a patch. It's a way of keeping the show on the road while we get the emissions down, but it is a vital one. And the reason carbon dioxide removal is desirable or is at least desired, is because the money will be there for it in the way that it is not for alternative technologies at the moment, and because it is less controversial than holding the temperature down. Why that should be so is a good question, but it is a fact. So we have these 2 million ton a year carbon dioxide plants going up in West Texas and Louisiana, I believe, and two more underway or sort of in the planning stages. And President Biden's talking about yet more. I don't mind if you build 10 of these things, but you're going to have to build 10,000 if you're serious about, getting back down from where we are now, let alone where we're likely to end up. And I don't think you have the money for that. So this is a demonstrator. And as a demonstrator, I'm happy with it. But for God's sake, pay attention to the stuff that really needs to be done now.
Let's now turn to geoengineering or climate engineering, or as we typically call it on Challenging Climate, SRM, solar radiation modification, which would cool the planet by reflecting a portion of incoming sunlight back into space. Where do you see the debates around SRM and SRM research fitting into the wider climate change conversation right now?
Well, I would say by now, I have not done a poll, anonymized or otherwise, but I would say that around half of the climate scientists I know, and that's around 100 whom I would know by first name, now in their secret heart of hearts believe that climate engineering will be necessary. A far smaller number would say it even to me, though they know me, but I am a journalist, it will get out. And the career-long curse that once awaited any climate scientist who talked about climate engineering still lurks in the corner. I think it's very important to understand how this came about, because it doesn't seem like it was inevitable that it should. You see, here we have in 1988, Margaret Thatcher talks to the Royal Society and puts climate change on the table. And Jim Hansen in the United States puts it on the table with the US Congress. And suddenly we have it. And the immediate reactions are very creditable. By 1990, we are talking about creating a treaty. By 1994, there is a treaty for mitigation. They got a lot wrong. They didn't understand that the third world was going to industrialize and the emissions were going to go up a lot faster and bigger and farther than they thought. But that's pretty good. Now, at that point, and bear in mind, at that point, they knew nothing about feedbacks. There were vague ideas. Everybody knows that when we came out of the last ice age, it was pretty catastrophic for a while. There were large surprises that lasted 1,000 years and things like that. But essentially, the job is getting emissions down. You mustn't confuse the public. Focus on that. No subtitles, no footnotes, cut your emissions. It'll be okay. And so it became a vow of silence. You mustn't discuss in front of the children, the public, any thoughts you might have about alternative courses of action, supplementary courses of action, surprises beyond that of just, the emissions steadily growing at a predictable rate. And, well, you have at least 12 years from the time that the treaty, the UNFCCC, that was signed in 94. And nobody until 2006 says a word in public. In the entire scientific community, nobody breaks the silence to say, well, not doing too well on this front. Should we consider trying directly to hold the temperature down? And it was Paul Crutzen, Dutch scientist working in Germany, who broke the silence in 2006 and said, have you noticed we're not cutting the emissions? The emissions are still trending upwards, and actually because of the industrialization in the third world, they're trending up faster than we thought. And we are adding, and have been adding ever since, more than 1 degree and we are adding 2 parts per million per annum, not cutting. We have been doing that since we signed the treaty. The rate at which we are adding parts per million is going up. Should we maybe consider other or additional alternatives? And Crutzen said, look, we're making no headway at all with this. You can see where it's going. Just extend the curve you've got. And he's not even talking feedbacks. He's got a smooth curve driven entirely by emissions. And we're screwed if you go down this curve, and you really should be thinking about holding the temperature down at least until you sort out your emissions problem, because you're not dealing with it now. And he was ostracized. I mean, I met him, I think, a couple of years after that. It was at a CDR at a conference there. The man was broken. He'd been ostracized by his own profession. He'd had torrents of abuse. You broke the silence, brother. You told them it wasn't working and we probably need a fallback position for the short term. But there was a number of other brave people backed him at the time. But they definitely learned a lesson, which is say that stuff out loud. And this was learned by the profession. And there were, of course, people policing it within the profession. If you talked about doing more than cutting emissions, about cutting the warming, reducing the warming, or at least slowing the warming in order to give yourself more leeway on the emissions front, you could lose your job. You would certainly lose your friends. You would be ostracized. It was a career killer move, unless you were very senior. And that omerta, that we don't talk about that in public, I would say lasted virtually unbroken until at least 2010, more likely 2015. Everybody knew, everybody knew that mitigation wasn't doing the job. But even research on it was not entirely banned, but was hugely deprecated.
But where are we now? How has that changed? So Paul Crutzen was ostracized as much as a Nobel laureate can be ostracized, and things were certainly
He would
chilly in the
never have
early.
dared to do it if he didn't have all those tickets. But even with those tickets, it didn't really protect him. And he's gone now. But very shyly, some climate scientists had began to emerge into the light saying, look, we do need to talk about this, because we're not doing the emissions control at the rate we said we had to. And we're getting into, and by now we know about feedbacks and where we might trigger them, and we're closing in on those numbers, those tripwires. It's extraordinary and extends down to the present. It has become so ingrained, this taboo against discussing climate engineering, that even those who are recommending it can barely bring themselves to say the phrase. I'll give you a specific example, and I've got it on film. When Jim Hansen published his recent 70-page paper, which concludes, of course, that among the things we have to do now is geoengineering. He never uses the word. And I was interviewing him at his home in Pennsylvania. We're sitting there at the table, and I watch him find 5 ways to avoid saying the phrase while we were talking about it. He could not bring himself to say, I've got these 3 recommendations. There's this, and there's that, and there's geoengineering. No, he never could say it. He meant it. He wanted me to get it, but he couldn't bring himself to say the actual words. I mean, it has become a tribal taboo, and gradually it's been broken. I mean, we've all had tribal taboos somewhere in our history, and many of them have eventually been eliminated, but it does take time. And that one's still there. Now, there are other reasons to be concerned about geoengineering. I'm not saying it's a harmless or wholly virtuous thing that we must adopt and there's no worries, not at all. But among the things that have suffered is all the research that should have been done, so you'd have the answers to your concerns about geoengineering. I mean, even now there are petitions circulating not really among climate scientists, but among those in the social sciences and so on who interest themselves in these matters, trying to ban research. Are you serious? You want to ban research in the issue that is of most importance to the planet?
Well, there's a specific risk or concern around climate engineering or geoengineering that I'd like to ask you, because you're one of the rare specimens who has substantial past expertise in international relations and in history before coming to the climate issue, and specifically before coming to the issue of solar radiation modification. And a common argument against considering SRM or geoengineering as a potential additional means to reduce climate impacts is that countries could never agree on whether and how to use it. And a common implication of this, a part of this, is that there would be deep international strife over who makes the decision, how much do we use, when do we use it, finger pointing, blame, etc. What are your thoughts on this international conflict, international security concern around the use of SRM geoengineering?
I find it naive because it exaggerates vastly the lack of control, lack of fine control of the great powers over what happens on their patch, and a ridiculously overhyped inability to cooperate. This is the most cooperative the world has ever been. We are now in the 79th year since nuclear weapons were first and last used. If you polled 1,000 scientists or 1,000 military or 1,000 average citizens in 1945 and asked them, you're going to go 75, 79 years without another weapon like that being used in 1945? You wouldn't have found one who believed we were going to make it 79 years. And no great power, mainly because of the fear of nuclear weapons, no nuclear power has ever directly fought another nuclear power for the last 79 years. This is actually what we would, if we were being rational, call a success. And despite all that's going on, despite Gaza, despite Ukraine, the significant thing about Ukraine is not that the idiot Russians invaded a neighboring country, is that everybody else is dealing with it as best they can without going anywhere near a nuclear war. So they're not stupid, they're not crazy, and very few people have the ability, let alone the inclination, to go to war over whether or not somebody puts some gas into the atmosphere. There is a dangerous rhetoric which suggests that any slight thing you might do in the atmosphere has immediate and catastrophic effects. Come on, you know? Every 20 years or so, we have a volcano that puts an amount of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere that vastly exceeds the amount that's being discussed. Now, okay, it goes away again quicker than long-term geoengineering would, but we're talking about, for example, last big volcano that did that we have statistics on, Pinatubo, 1991, 17 million tons of sulfur dioxide in the stratosphere is the default figure. I mean, who knows, but it's close to that. It's in that vicinity. Nobody is talking about putting 17 billion tons of sulfur dioxide in the stratosphere in the early stages of a geoengineering experiment. They have no means of doing it at that volume. So there's a problem in experimental terms with putting sulfur dioxide in the stratosphere, which is what is mostly being talked about. You could find other things like calcium, that would do the job as well. But this is the one that ticks most boxes in terms of being efficient and non-dangerous and so on. The long-term implications of that are relatively small. There's some concern about whether it might slow the healing of the ozone hole, because it does interact with ozone to some extent in a certain season. And I've spoken to a number of people who actually work in that aspect of climate science. And most of them have said to me, nobody has said it immediately, everybody goes blind from ultraviolet radiation north and south of latitude 60. But they say, yeah, there was some erosion of the ozone hole when the last big volcano did it. And not clear whether the one we had in the Pacific a couple of years ago, which put a lot of water into the stratosphere, but it was an underwater volcano. We have no evidence that that's had an effect. But the effect is not sufficiently large to reverse the shrinkage of the ozone hole that has now begun because we've stopped emitting all those nasty chemicals. At the worst, it would slow it a bit. Okay, so there's that. And then there's the famous unknown unknowns, which people make a big meal of. But the idea that this is some massive and irrevocable step which could have immediate and catastrophic consequences is complete, if you'll excuse the old phrase, poppycock. If it has adverse effects, stop doing it. And, unless the effects are immediate, irrevocable, and huge, it stops. You haven't given me any examples of how immediate, irrevocable changes would be incurred by putting, enough to give you a quarter of a degree of warming and see for a few years how that works before you up it a bit. And you're never going to go more than half, because the other problem that keeps getting thrown in everybody's faces is that you move the rainfall around, and various people die from starvation or rebel because they've had their rainfall stolen because you moved intertropical convergence zone north or south off of their patch. The people who are actually working on climate engineering sorted that problem out 7, 8 years ago, which is to say, well, if when we control for all of the warming, we move the rainfall around, if we control for half the warming, what do we do? And the answer is it doesn't move anymore. The problem is the warming escalates more, the rainfall escalates rapidly when we're warming the planet, and it declines when we're cooling the planet, but the decline happens more rapidly with the rainfall, or it moves around, which is the same thing. I've talked to the people and read the papers and so on about that, and basically that's a dead issue for people who are paying attention.
And of course, if I may opine a bit, such risks, including but not limited to these concerns around international tensions that we started with my previous questions of SRM, must be compared to those of the climate change that it would hopefully reduce. So you might say, well, the prospect of decision-making around SRM might increase some international tension, but what about that extra half a degree, 1 degree of warming that's on the other side of the ledger, which could displace populations moving from warmer areas to cooler areas, potentially destabilizing both regions in the process.
The negative political consequences of not doing it are immensely larger, in my view, than the likely consequences of doing it. I wish I had a conspiracy theory to explain why all this is happening, but I don't. I mean, it's ignorance more than anything else. Sometimes willful ignorance and fear of the unknown. I mean, we know about the kind of consequences that turning the temperature will have, and they're pretty horrifying, but we know about them, and we've gone through that kind of consequences before. This is a different kind of consequences, and somebody will be to blame specifically, and I don't want to be that person or associated with that person, should the SRM go wrong. A good deal of superstition, or superstitious behavior, I should say, and a reluctance to take chances blindly, unaware of the fact that you are already at the table and betting high. With every 1/10 of a degree of warming that you cause with your current reluctance, the odds against your having a pleasant retirement go up a lot.
Let's zoom out a bit to a broader concept that you use regularly in your book, and one that I find personally to be quite interesting, and that is the phrase planetary maintenance engineers. What is the origin of this phrase, and what do you mean by it in your book?
The phrase originates with Jim Lovelock, the founder of the Gaia theory, which he always regretted calling that. It's now called Earth System Science in the universities. And it is actually the focus of the earth sciences in general these days, because what he did was he integrated not just the biosphere, but the atmosphere and the oceans and the geosphere, the rocks, into a single interlocking series of entities and phenomena which had co-evolved, including even some of the rocks. And that's the way people look at the world now, but it's his idea. And he, in his very first book in 1979, first book at the age of already about 60. He wrote 10 more and died at the age of 102. But his first book in 1979, he wrote about what we now call Earth System Science, the need to look at the integrated system as a whole and its interactions, not to take isolated phenomena and treat them as though they were independent. None of them are independent. He said this, and I can almost quote the phrase verbatim, but I won't. I'll get some bits wrong, so I won't try. He said, if we continue on the present path, and he wasn't actually just talking about climate, he was talking about the Earth system, so he was talking about the various pressures on it, including the use of growing amounts of energy and the devastation caused by the agriculture you need to support many, many billions of people and so on. He said at some point, these interlocking, interdependent, co-evolved systems will lose the ability to regulate the Earth system independently. And that at that point, it will devolve upon us, if we can manage it, to maintain all those interlocking systems. The lifelong, miserable job of being the planetary maintenance engineers. Because we will have knocked out all of the co-evolved, interdependent, self-starting systems that guarantee the stability of the climate and much else besides. He wasn't really talking about global warming in 1979, but the concept was clear. And now, I actually wanted to call this book Planetary Maintenance Engineers. The publisher talked me out of it using violence and alcohol, because it wouldn't sell. And he was right, of course. But it is what it's about. It's about our fate if we don't get on top of this. And in fact, to some extent, already our fate, because we aren't on top of it, is to become planetary maintenance engineers, which is a miserable, lifelong, very expensive job that may be impossible to do well. But that's where you go if you don't get this right. Either that or into the dark because you can't get it right.
That is as good of a note as I can imagine to end our conversation. Our guest today has been Gwynne Dyer. His new book, which I strongly recommend, is Intervention Earth, Life-Saving Ideas from the World's Climate Engineers. Gwynne, thank you for joining us on Challenging Climate.
You're welcome, Jesse. It's been a pleasure.
Well, thanks for listening. Please rate or review us on Apple Podcasts and elsewhere, and consider supporting us on Patreon. That's patreon.com/challengingclimate.